video, we're going to consider rhythms of assessing for human learning. In a sense, we want to be able to grow in our ability to design our courses in such a way that it makes it more likely that students are learning. So, before we get to designing learning, we have to talk about this relationship between teaching and learning and how we define whether this is effective or not. So this diagram here, this Venn diagram, comes from Stephen Chu. He's a cognitive psychologist, professor at Samford University. And I think this is a really helpful way to think about what makes a lesson, what makes a class effective or not. And it really lies at the intersection of three things. First, the knowledge of your field, of your academic discipline. It comes at the intersection also of the knowledge of how people learn within your field, so kind of disciplinary ways of doing things, of knowing. And finally, knowledge of how people learn. There's a lot we could say about the cognitive science here. This training is going to give you specific strategies very directed toward this area that could be used across academic disciplines. And as much as people sometimes make much about differences between adult learners versus younger learners, the things that are most impactful for human learning that we know emphatically about, that the research has been indicating for 100 years or many decades in some situations, are that the things that are most impactful are actually common across all humans, all ages, so on. So those are the things we try to build our activities around, the things we know are common, the things we know have been shown to be generally quite effective. And so if that's the case, that the intersection of these three things comes to bear on effective teaching, this training is going to provide you a lot of things in the area of how people learn. But what you're going to bring to the table here, obviously, is your own academic discipline and the ways of knowing and of doing things within the discipline. So we're going to try to bring all of that to bear here. But something has to happen before the teaching. We have to set up the conditions, again, that make it likely for students to be learning well. And so that comes to the ways we plan and design our course. Later on in the training, we'll give you some specific things to use in the moment during your class. But for right now, we're going to try to focus on what we call the instructional design of your course. So for a moment here, we're going to watch just a brief piece of a video from Lee Wiggins. He and his colleague coined the term backwards design and has some really helpful things to say about course planning, about lesson planning that are going to be helpful. As we watch, I want you to do something. I want you to have something to write with, and I want you to walk away from this brief video segment with two things. It could be a question, it could be something you're still thinking about or would like to think more about, or maybe just something you've learned. So any combination of those three things, a question, something you were still thinking about, or something you learned, try to walk away with at least two of those. Let's go ahead to the video.
UBD is not a philosophy of teaching. It's not an approach to teaching. It's a planning framework. And it's really important to keep this in mind, that what you're trying to do is make it more likely by design that when you teach, you're more goal-focused, more effective. You could be a bad teacher with a good plan. In other words, we're not saying that a good plan makes you a better teacher necessarily. You have to learn pedagogical moves. You have to learn to be facile and skilled with how to pay attention to group dynamics. UBD doesn't help you with that, but it does prepare you to think short-term, long-term, what are we trying to accomplish? And it's like the famous line from Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind. You're totally prepared for teachable moments, not in the sense of, oh, well, that's a cool student comment. Let's just run with that for 5 days. That's not serendipity. That's letting the students write the curriculum. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being so prepared about where you want to end up that you hear a potential student comment as a fantastic entry point to go where you want to end up. In other words, it's your job to know where we want to end up. I don't think we make any apologies about that. But part of where we want to end up is building autonomous, proactive, thoughtful people. Not just march through some stuff, causing some typical learning. So we're trying to keep long-term goals in view. we're trying to get the blend of content and performance right. Notice I didn't say process, content and performance, because that's the ultimate goal. The student performs, as in the soccer situation, on their own, effectively, fluently, drawing from their repertoire. And this also tends to better engage people, as I think you already know. What we see over and over again is that there's a misalignment between short-term plans and actions and long-term goals. Here's a simple example. We value something called critical and creative thinking. It's in every program's goal statement. It's in many school mission statements. It's clearly something we care about. But it is possible to get straight A's at every school in America without critical and creative thinking. As long as you're smart, compliant, do your work, are thorough, you're going to get straight A's in almost every school in America. So a very basic backward design premise then. If critical and creative thinking is the goal long term, using content critically and creatively, to say it a slightly different way, then when we go to plan, we have to make sure week in and week out that we're focusing on critical and creative use of content. Otherwise, we're not going to get it.
The concept of backwards design was popularized by Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, who you just saw in the video, in their 1998 book, Understanding by Design. There's 3 basic steps in what we call backwards design. First, identify desired results and learning outcomes. Where are we headed? Determine acceptable evidence. How will we know once we get there? And finally, plan learning experiences and instruction. So in other words, what are the specific road markers? How are we going to navigate the path ahead? Wiggins and McTighe say, given a destination, what's the most effective and efficient travel routes? They say this, quote, our lessons, units, and courses should be logically inferred from the results sought, not derived from the methods, books, and activities with which we are most comfortable. It is analogous to travel planning. Our framework should provide a set of itineraries deliberately designed to meet cultural goals rather than a purposeless tour of all the major sites in a foreign country. In short, the best designs derive backward from the learnings sought. End quote. So, what does this look like? How do we move from our syllabus to actually helping this to happen? So, we might start here with our learning objective, our student learning outcome. It's one of those things we list at the top of the syllabus. It's right there. Students see it on the first day of class. Well, typically those learning outcomes are mapped in some way towards a major assessment of some kind. For the Quest program, typically it's going to be a larger project, maybe a research paper, right? So that's the major thing. But beyond that, how are we setting students up in ways that help them achieve with excellence? And I'm not talking about hand-holding here. What I'm talking about is helping to make the right things effortful. The way we do this is by breaking down those major assessments into smaller activities where they get to practice either prerequisite thinking or prerequisite skills, prerequisite practices that are going to build towards the final demonstration of learning on those larger assessments. It's much like at a sporting practice where we're not going to be just scrimmaging all of the time. We're going to work on specific drills that will build towards putting everything together in a game, right? It's very much what we are doing here. So again, we'll talk a bit more about how to do that, how to break out your major projects into specific scaffolded steps in the next section of this training. But essentially, when we talk about assessing student learning, it needs to happen at these various levels. It needs to not only happen at the major level, but also at these smaller places where we get to step in and see their thinking while it's still in formation. So let's define assessment. What is assessment? Essentially, the term means measurement, but I like this definition here. Assessment is process and product of determining whether the students have learned what they were expected to learn from instruction. Process and products. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of assessment we could talk about. I'm just going to highlight the 2 big ones. Formative and summative assessment. These are 2 broad categories. Again, there are others. But formative assessment provides an indication of student thinking as it is in process or formation. So one metaphor that communicates this is the idea of a scaffold. You hang around education folks very much, you'll hear this term. So formative assessment helps us understand the ways we come alongside students, coach them through the prerequisite thinking, concepts, skills that they'll need to accomplish those larger course outcomes. Formative assessment causes us to ask what opportunities we are creating early on to step in before that final paper or exam is completed to guide their thinking and process. Here we can give them opportunities to make improvements or changes before it is too late to identify erroneous thinking or practice. So examples might include real-time discussion prompts, a quick write, think, pair, share activity, something like that. You might also use technology such as Plickers or Nearpod to capture a picture of every student's understanding in the moment. Quick quizzes do this really well. These formative assessments are not necessarily always graded, other than completion or participation. They're meant to be low stakes. They're meant to be opportunities where students can take intellectual risks. So we want them to step in and do these things without the worry of tanking their grade. The second major type of assessment is identified as summative. And as the title may indicate, it happens really at the end of things. It's a bit more like this painting. The student completing this work to demonstrate they've actually got these competencies and skills. So in doing so, we're going to know whether they've actually achieved mastery of the concepts we're teaching. Here the student should pick the right colors, use the right techniques, and along the way, the formative assessments were helping us monitor their progress toward that end. But the summative assessment represents that masterpiece painting they complete at the ends. There's not often a regular feedback loop with ongoing formative assessment. It's submitted, feedback's provided, but the grade was essentially written in stone in this kind of higher stakes situation. So traditional tests, final exams, larger papers, others follow this model. For a Quest program, you'll largely be using a project for your summative assessment, but also likely designing formative checkpoints for students along the way. So these things work in tandem. They are not really pitted against each other. The goal is for us to map them together in a way that paints a coherent assessment picture. Well, one last thing I want to say about assessment is regarding rubrics and using them as a tool to help us do this. Rubrics are an incredibly helpful tool to assist you in assessing student work, and they work in more than one direction. They set an expectation for students as they complete the work, before they get started even, and they serve to assist your objectivity and focus in the grading process. Now, they don't mean you're going to be perfectly objective, right? Sometimes we can make too much of that, but they do assist. They're no replacement for effective feedback either, but they are a helpful way to save time, and they really will. It takes time to build one on the front end, but they save you time in the grading process, as you can focus your comments building on the foundation the rubric laid once you have those good descriptions laid out. Notice in the example here, rubrics are typically laid out in rows of criteria with the highest possible rating beginning at the left. Now, some rubrics I've seen can have an incredible number of both criteria and levels of achievement for each. I really recommend against too much detail here, as it starts to work against our aims of guiding students and being useful for our grading. Personally, I recommend 3 rating levels as a best practice. Notice in this example, I've laid these out as not yet meeting expectations, and then exceeding expectations. Each rating description provides a thicker description than simply excellent or average. Novice learners don't know what those things mean in your course. And yet they don't also provide large paragraphs of text, which would again prevent effective use by students and faculty. It's a tricky balance. Each criterion level also has a brief descriptive paragraph. A helpful rule of thumb here would be 3 to 5 criterion levels depending on what you have in your project. Some rubrics may only need 1 criteria, so think carefully about the things you actually want to measure or assess as aligned to your course learning outcomes. Just because you've always assessed something doesn't mean it necessarily ought to be. Now, you likely don't need a rubric for everything, but it can speed things up in Canvas depending on how many criteria you have. If you simply want to mark something for completion, I recommend using that setting in Canvas rather than creating a 1 criterion rubric. Now, it can take a fair bit of time to create a rubric, but you are saving in the long term when it comes to grading well. If you haven't had much experience with rubrics yet, or writing them, you may wish to search the internet within your academic discipline for examples you might be able to adapt for your courses. Additionally, some examples will be provided for you in this training. So all of these things work together as we think about assessing and measuring student learning, and doing so in a regular rhythm so that we understand that students are actually on track to meet our learning goals.